My uncle once said there was a time when German cities trusted the weather. Cloud meant safety, darkness meant protection. He said it like he was remembering a rule everyone believed. Years later, reading RAF Pathfinder reports and technical records, I found he was right. The confidence in overcast skies was documented, and so was the moment it failed. I've listed the sources in the description below. What changed wasn't bigger bombs or brighter flares. It was a signal, a calculation. And after that, even the clouds could no longer promise safety. Here is that story.
Somewhere over the Dutch lowlands, a German night fighter lifts from a concrete runway, gear folding into its belly, twin engines climbing hard into a February darkness that swallows everything beyond the wingtips. The flare path fades behind him. The runway lights compress into a single amber thread and then vanish. He is alone in the cold air, climbing toward the altitude where ground controllers will vector him into a bomber stream, heading for the Ruhr. Minutes pass. Instruments glow. Then a burst of tracer fire rips past the cockpit canopy from above and behind, close enough to light up the inside of the fuselage. The rounds come from an aircraft that was already there, already waiting, already circling above his own base in the dark. How did a Canadian crew turn Germany's air defense into a trap? To understand what happened above that airfield and what it meant for the air war over Europe, it is necessary to go back to the defense system that made German night fighters so lethal in the first place. Because by 1942, the skies over the Reich were not open darkness. They were organized, controlled, subdivided into killing zones where radar, ground controllers, searchlights, and twin-engine interceptors worked in careful coordination to find, track, and destroy RAF bombers before they could reach their targets. The architecture of this defense had a name. The British called it the Kammhuber Line, after the Luftwaffe general who built it. The Kammhuber Line was the name given to the German night air defense system, established in July 1940 by Colonel Joseph Kammhuber. It stretched from Denmark to the middle of France, a wall of electronics and firepower arranged across every plausible bomber route into Germany. The first version of the line consisted of a series of radar stations, with overlapping coverage layered 3 deep from Denmark to the middle of France, each covering a zone about 32 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide. Each segment of that wall was called a Himmelbett zone, a word that translated with grim irony as canopy bed. Each control center was known as a Himmelbett zone, consisting of a Freya radar with a range of about 100 kilometers, a master searchlight directed by the radar, and a number of manually directed searchlights spread through the cell. Each zone was a self-contained interception box. 1 primary night fighter, 1 backup, 1 long-range Freya radar to detect inbound bombers at distance, and 2 shorter-range Würzburg tracking radars, precise enough to follow both the bomber and the fighter simultaneously, feeding position data to a ground controller who talked the interceptor into an attack geometry. Later versions of the Himmelbett added 2 Würzburg radars with a range of about 30 kilometers. Unlike the early warning, Freya, Würzburgs were accurate and complex tracking radars. One was locked onto the night fighter as soon as it entered the cell, and as soon as the Freya picked up a target, the second Würzburg locked onto it. All position reports were sent to the Himmelbett control center, thereby allowing controllers to get continual readings of the positions of both planes. It was mechanical, precise, repeatable. A bomber would cross the coast, enter one of these boxes, and immediately the system engaged. The Freya would detect it. The Würzburgs would lock on. A calm voice in the ground bunker would begin issuing headings and altitudes to the night fighter pilot already airborne and circling inside the zone, waiting for trade. The fighter would close to within a few hundred meters, pick up the bomber's silhouette against the faint glow of exhaust, or acquire it on his own short-range Liechtenstein airborne radar. Then the killing began. A burst of cannon fire from below and behind. An engine catching flame, a fuselage breaking apart, a bomber spinning down into the dark fields of Holland or Belgium, 7 men inside. These zones were arranged in an echelon formation, extending from the western borders inward toward key industrial areas, allowing for staggered engagements as RAF bombers penetrated deeper into German territory. A multi-layer defense structure characterized the system, with forward coastal zones equipped with long-range Freya radars for early warning and detection up to 100 miles, transitioning to rearward Himmelbett zones that provided depth and precision tracking via Würzburg radars. By 1943, this layering created substantial defensive depth over critical regions like the Ruhr, where the overall system extended approximately 100 miles inland. This was the architecture of confidence. For the German night fighter crews and their ground controllers, the system worked because it reduced the enormous chaos of night air warfare to something manageable, something almost procedural. A bomber enters the box, the radars track it, the fighter closes, the bomber dies. Each box was a definite functioning system, technically capable of putting a night fighter very accurately onto the tail of a hostile bomber. The geometry of it was elegant and deadly, and it gave German commanders a sense of sovereignty over their own night sky that went beyond operational metrics. It felt like control, it felt like mastery, and it was about to be turned inside out. Like and subscribe to support more true wartime intelligence stories. For the men flying Lancasters, Halifaxes, Wellingtons, and Stirlings into Germany during 1941 and 1942, the Kammhuber Line was not an abstraction. It was the thing that killed them, not in a single dramatic blow, but raid after raid, week after week, in a slow bleed that no amount of courage could staunch. Aircraft like the Whitley and Hampton were not capable of launching raids deep into enemy territory, while tactics were primitive and losses were high. Bomber Command was compelled to switch to inaccurate night bombing in an effort to reduce casualties. But switching to night did not bring safety. It only changed the nature of the threat. Darkness that should have been a shield was becoming a killing ground because the Germans had figured out how to see in the dark. The bombers flew slowly. The heavy four-engine types cruised at around 165 miles per hour, loaded down with fuel and ordnance, vibrating through the cold air at altitudes where their exhaust trails could betray them, and their silhouettes could be picked up against clouds lit from below. In 1941, the lumbering twin-engine heavies crossed enemy territory at about 165 miles per hour in a thin stream, often many miles apart, generally unsure of their position, and often having to spend as long as an hour taking astro shots, working out revised winds and searching for their target. They were vulnerable from the moment they crossed the enemy coast until the moment they recrossed it hours later, if they crossed it at all. Early in the war, Bomber Command sent its aircraft individually, spreading them out across the night sky, hoping to dilute the defenses by making each plane a needle in a vast dark haystack. At the time, RAF Bomber Command sent its aircraft singly to divide the defenses, meaning that any one bomber had to deal with little concentrated flak. But this also meant that each Himmelbett center had to deal with only one or two aircraft at a time, much easing the German task. The logic seemed sound, but it was precisely wrong. Sending bombers one at a time meant each Himmelbett box faced a workload it could easily handle. Every arrival was a fresh opportunity for a clean interception. Bomber Command crews suffered a high casualty rate. 55,573 were killed out of a total of 125,000 aircrew, a 44.4% death rate. A further 8,403 men were wounded in action, and 9,838 became prisoners of war. The scale of it was staggering, and for the men who returned from each raid, the mathematics of survival was terrifying. During the RCAF's Halifax operations between March 1943 and February 1944, the average loss rate was 6.05%. Producing a mere 16% survival rate for a tour of 30 operations. At those rates, most crews who began an operational tour would not finish it. The odds were not against them in the dramatic sense of a coin flip. They were against them in the grinding sense of attrition, where each sortie subtracted from a shrinking reserve of probability. The overall loss rate for Bomber Command operations was 2.2%, but loss rates over Germany were significantly higher. From November 1943 to March 1944, losses averaged 5.1%. The highest loss rate, 11.8%, was incurred on the Nuremberg raid of March 30, 1944. German night fighter pilots were accumulating astonishing personal tallies. Men like Helmut Lent, who would eventually be credited with 76 night kills. Men like Heinrich zu Sein-Wittgenstein and Wolfgang Schnaufer, whose names became synonymous with the night over Western Europe. Lent was acknowledged to have 76 and led the Luftwaffe in this field. Streibe's total stood at 63, Mohr 62 at his death. For these pilots, the Himmelbett system was not just infrastructure. It was the instrument of their expertise. Ground control brought them close. Their own radar and night vision did the rest. And this was the crisis facing RAF Bomber Command. Not a single catastrophic defeat, but a steady, relentless erosion that threatened to make the entire strategic bombing offensive unsustainable. The bombers could not outfly the fighters. They could not outshoot them. They could not hide from radar. Something had to change, not in the bomber force itself, but in the system that was feeding the fighters their targets. The defense network had to be disrupted, not just avoided, not just survived, disrupted at its source. The question was how. The answer, or at least part of it, was already sitting on airfields across southern England. Built from birch plywood, balsa, and Ecuadorian spruce, held together with caisson glue, it did not look like the future of anything. It looked, if anything, like a mistake, a beautiful, improbable wooden mistake. The de Havilland H-98 Mosquito is a British twin-engined multi-role combat aircraft, introduced during the Second World War. Unusual in that its airframe was constructed mostly of wood, it was nicknamed the Wooden Wonder, or Mossy. In 1941, it was one of the fastest operational aircraft in the world. The Mosquito had been born from an idea that the Air Ministry initially rejected. Geoffrey de Havilland and his team at Hatfield proposed a bomber so fast it would need no defensive armament at all. No gun turrets, no gunners. Just speed, altitude, and the clean aerodynamic efficiency of a wooden airframe powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Originally conceived as an unarmed fast bomber, the Mosquito's use evolved during the war into many roles, including low to medium altitude daytime tactical bomber, high altitude night bomber, pathfinder, day or night fighter, fighter bomber, intruder, maritime strike, and photo reconnaissance aircraft. The performance figures made skeptics blink. Over the next few months, the prototype surpassed estimates, easily beating the Spitfire Mark II in tests at RAF Boscombe down in Wiltshire in February 1941, reaching a top speed of 392 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, compared to a top speed of 360 miles per hour at 19,500 feet for the Spitfire. A twin-engine aircraft that could outrun a Spitfire. It seemed absurd. It was also true. The crew was minimal. The crew of two, pilot and navigator, sat side by side. No waist gunners scanning the darkness. No tail gunner isolated in his turret. Just two men, shoulder to shoulder in a compact cockpit, relying on speed rather than firepower for survival. And the Luftwaffe could not catch it. Not easily, not reliably. Post-war German histories indicate that there was a belief within the Luftwaffe that Mosquito aircraft gave only a weak radar signal. The wooden construction, the low radar cross-section, the raw velocity at altitude, all of it combined to make the Mosquito something German night defenses were not designed to handle. In April 1943, in response to political humiliation caused by the Mosquito, Göring ordered the formation of special Luftwaffe units to combat the Mosquito attacks, though these units were unsuccessful against the elusive RAF aircraft. For the Intruder role, the Mosquito was being adapted into something more predatory. The night fighter variants carried AI radar in the nose, 4 20mm Hispano cannons, and 4.303 Browning machine guns. The NF Mark II was a night fighter equipped with onboard radar and entered home defense service in August 1942. Due to its excellent radar, high speed, and powerful armament of 8 guns, it was successful in intercepting German bomber aircraft. Later Marks, especially the FB Mark VI fighter bomber, could carry bombs as well as guns, giving crews the option to strafe or bomb an airfield before hunting above it. In 1943, they would be joined by the FB Mark VI, which had much longer range, allowing the intruders to range across Germany. What made the Mosquito lethal for intruder work was not any single attribute. It was the combination. Speed enough to outrun anything that spotted it, range enough to reach deep into occupied territory and loiter, firepower enough to destroy an aircraft in a single pass, and a radar signature small enough to approach without warning, a weapon built of wood, faster than anything the enemy could send against it, carrying 2 men into the darkest corners of the air war. This was the aircraft that would turn the hunters' own airfields into killing grounds. The concept was not complicated. It was, in a sense, breathtakingly simple. Instead of trying to protect the bombers directly, instead of adding more guns or more armor or more electronic countermeasures to the heavy aircraft lumbering toward the Ruhr, a different question was asked. What if you attacked the fighters before they could attack the bombers? Not in the air over the target, not in the bomber stream, but at the one place where every night fighter had to be, sooner or later. At home. On the ground. Climbing out in the first vulnerable seconds of takeoff. Or sliding in on final approach, gear down, flaps down, speed bleeding off, committed to a landing path from which there was no quick escape. The RAF began running Intruder operations in May 1942. These involved night fighters attacking German night fighter bases in France and the Low Countries, in the hope the disruption caused might reduce the heavy losses being suffered by Bomber Command. The idea was as old as air, warfare itself, but now it had a new vehicle and a new urgency. Initially, these squadrons were equipped with the Bristol Blenheim and Douglas Havocks and Bostons. From the spring of 1942, some of these units began to receive the Mosquito NF Mark II, although without its radar set. These aircraft had the range to perform intruder missions over France, Belgium, and Holland. Early intruder missions were flown with older types, aircraft that lacked the speed and range to penetrate deep or linger long. The Blenheim was too slow. The Havoc was adequate over northern France, but could not reach the airfields deeper in Germany where the most effective night fighter units were based. These early missions demonstrated the principle, but not the full potential. When Mosquitoes began replacing Bostons and Havocks on intruder squadrons, the tactical equation changed. Night intruder sorties against Luftwaffe training fields in northern France began in July 1942. The NF-2 specials were stripped of AI radar, so that its secrets would not fall into German hands, but Mosquito pilots were able to jump Luftwaffe aircraft, flying lit up with their landing and navigation lights on. The image is worth holding. German aircraft flying with their navigation lights on, approaching their own bases in what they believed was safe airspace, and above them, invisible in the darkness, a Mosquito waiting. The fundamental assumption underlying the entire German night defense system was that the airfields were safe havens, that once a fighter returned to the vicinity of its base, it had survived the night. The intruder doctrine aimed to destroy that assumption. It was not a matter of shooting down vast numbers of aircraft, although that happened. It was a matter of injecting uncertainty into the one place where certainty was essential. If a night fighter pilot could not trust that his own runway was safe, every sortie became a double gamble, the mission itself and the return home. The psychological dimension was not a side effect. It was the primary weapon. The intruders made the Germans so jumpy that in at least one case a pilot simply flew into the ground while being pursued by a Mosquito. The intruders soon forced the Luftwaffe to move the training squadrons back to Germany, and that displacement itself was a victory. Every training field pushed deeper into the Reich meant longer transit times, more fuel burned, more hours in the air before a student pilot could even begin learning his craft. The Intruder campaign was not just about the kills, it was about reshaping the enemy's behavior through fear. Among the squadrons that flew these missions, some carried a different flag on their shoulders, not the RAF Roundel alone, but the maple leaf of the Royal Canadian Air Force. 4 RCAF night fighter squadrons, 406, 409, 410, and 418, flew Mosquitoes on night fighter and intruder operations. Number 418, Squadron RCAF, was a Canadian squadron that operated the Boston as a night intruder, then the Mosquito on day intruder, bomber escort, and anti-V1 duties. The squadron was formed at Debden on 15 November 1941 as an intruder squadron and was equipped with the Douglas Boston III. 418 was the RCAF's designated intruder squadron, and its history traces the evolution of the entire night offensive. Formed at Debden, Essex, England, on November 15, 1941, the unit flew Boston and Mosquito aircraft on day and night intruder operations deep into enemy territory. Its claim of 178 enemy aircraft and 79.5 V-1 flying bombs destroyed made it the top-scoring unit of the RCAF. The Canadians did not come to this role by accident. The RCAF contribution to the air war over Europe was enormous, proportionally devastating. In 1943, 3,031 Canadians and other RCAF personnel were killed. Young men from Edmonton, Winnipeg, Toronto, Vancouver, small towns in Saskatchewan and the Maritimes, found themselves stationed at bases in Essex and Sussex and Norfolk, flying aircraft built in Hatfield or Leavesden, navigating by stars and dead, reckoning over landscapes they had never seen in daylight. Number 4, 10. Cougar Squadron was an RCAF night fighter squadron that was formed at Ayr on the 30th of June, 1941, to defend central Scotland and the northeast of England against German raiders. It remained in the north for the next 2 years, upgrading to the Bristol Beaufighter and then the de Havilland Mosquito during that period. In February 1943, with the threat of German raids diminishing, the squadron moved south to Lincolnshire, from where it began to carry out intruder missions over France and the Low Countries. Training for these missions was intensive. The Mosquito demanded experienced hands. Potential Mosquito crews had to have flown for at least 1,000 hours already before they were considered suitable to volunteer. These men had previously flown heavier bombers and had a great deal of knowledge about the tremendous hazards of night operations against Nazi Germany. The Mosquito Force therefore contained some of the most experienced crews of the Royal Air Force. For the Canadian crews assigned to intruder operations, the psychological burden was different from that carried by the main force bomber crews. A Lancaster crew flew in a stream of hundreds, surrounded, at least notionally, by other aircraft heading to the same target. They had a specific destination, a bomb run, a turn for home. The night was terrible, but it was shared. An intruder crew flew alone, 2 men in a wooden aircraft crossing the channel at low level to avoid radar, climbing over the enemy coast, threading their way between known flak concentrations, heading deep into occupied territory toward a specific airfield whose defenses they could not fully predict. There was no stream to hide in, no electronic jamming aircraft clearing a path ahead, no master bomber directing the attack. Just the 2 of them, the glow of instruments, and the sound of twin Merlins cutting through frigid air. They carried no bomb sight aimed at an industrial target. Their target was other aircraft, machines that could shoot back, machines protected by dedicated anti-aircraft batteries. The intruder crew's job was to arrive before the enemy knew they were there, orbit in darkness, and wait. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, circling in the black sky above a German airfield, watching for the moment a runway lit up, or a pair of navigation lights appeared in the traffic pattern below. The waiting was the hardest part. Fuel burning, clock ticking. Every minute over enemy territory was a minute closer to being detected. The approach was a ritual of discipline and nerve. They crossed the English coast in the last minutes of daylight, or the first minutes of true darkness, depending on the season and the distance to their target. The intruders would fly at low level across the channel to avoid radar detection. They then had to pop up over the French coast to avoid new barrage balloons, making them targets for searchlights and flak. Low over the channel, very low, the altimeter unwinding until the surface of the water was a dark blur beneath them, close enough that spray could reach the windscreen in rough weather. At this height, the Freya radars along the enemy coast could not distinguish the aircraft from the sea return on their screens. The Mosquito became invisible by simply refusing to fly above the clutter. Then the coast. A sudden transition from the relative safety of open water to the immediate danger of flak batteries and searchlights strung along the littoral from the Pas de Calais to the Frisian Islands. The pilot pulled up just enough to clear the dunes and the cables of barrage balloons, then dropped back down. Low again, tree level, hedgerow level, the navigator working furiously, matching what he could see through the perspex nose to the map on his knee, calling corrections, tracking their position by dead reckoning and whatever landmarks the darkness would reveal. A river bend, a railway junction, the angular outline of a town where the blackout was not quite complete. Radio silence was absolute. Once across the coast, nothing went out. No position reports, no requests for bearings. The radio was switched to the German night fighter frequencies. and the two men listened. They listened for the chatter of ground controllers vectoring fighters, for the call signs of known night fighter units, for any signal that would tell them where the enemy was active tonight. Intelligence had given them a target airfield, sometimes two, but the real decisions were made in the air, in the dark, based on what they heard and what they saw. Over France, the landscape was a patchwork of shadow, roads and canals catching faint light, occasional fires from earlier raids, the red glow of industrial furnaces that could not be completely blacked out. The Mosquito speed was their primary defense, but at low level, speed was also a threat. A church steeple, a power line, a hill encountered a few seconds too late, any of these could kill as surely as a night fighter's cannon. As they neared the target airfield, the pilot throttled back and climbed slightly, establishing an orbit pattern at several thousand feet, high enough to see the airfield below, low enough to dive quickly when the moment came. And then they waited. The sky above a German night fighter base was one of the most dangerous places in the European air war, not because of the aircraft above, but because of the flak below. Every operational Luftwaffe airfield was ringed with light anti-aircraft guns, and their crews knew the sky above them was contested. A Mosquito orbiting at 3,000 feet was within easy range of 20mm and 37mm batteries that could fill the air with lethal fragments in seconds. So, the Intruder crew orbited wide, varied their altitude, changed direction unpredictably, watched, listened, and waited for the airfield to come alive. The moment arrived without warning. 1 second, the airfield below was dark, a featureless patch in the greater darkness of the German countryside. The next, a thin line of lights appeared, the flare path. A runway outlined in sodium lamps or gooseneck flares, laid out for the benefit of a night fighter returning from a sortie, or scrambling to intercept incoming bombers. For the German pilot below, the flare path was home, safety, the end of the mission, familiar ground. His wheels were coming down, his flaps were extending, his airspeed was bleeding off. His entire concentration was focused on the narrow cone of vision ahead of him, the runway threshold growing closer, the instruments confirming his glide slope, the gentle adjustments of throttle and stick that would bring him to a smooth touchdown. He was at the point of maximum vulnerability, slow, committed, unable to break away quickly without risking a stall or a ground impact. His aircraft was configured for landing, not combat. His attention was inward, not outward, and above him, the Mosquito was already diving. The attack profile was swift and terminal. The Intruder pilot pushed the nose down, building speed rapidly, the Merlins rising in pitch. The German aircraft appeared in the gun sight, framed against the flare path lights, its silhouette unmistakable. The range closed to a few hundred yards. The pilot pressed the firing button. 4 Hispano cannons and 4 Browning machine guns spoke simultaneously. The combined weight of fire was devastating at close range. Cannon shells punched through aluminum skin, through fuel tanks, through cockpit glass. The German aircraft did not so much crash as come apart, shedding pieces, trailing fire, rolling into the ground beside the runway. It had been seconds from touching. Their role was to take Mosquitoes at low level through the night across Europe, to loiter near a Luftwaffe airfield, to attack and shoot down returning enemy bombers or night fighters. The flare path went dark immediately. Airfield controllers, seeing one of their own destroyed on approach, killed the lights to protect any other aircraft in the pattern. But the damage was done, not just to the aircraft on the ground, not just to the crew inside it. The damage was to the assumption that this place was safe, that coming home was the end of danger. The Mosquito pulled up, climbing hard, engines at full power, accelerating away into the darkness before the flak batteries below could react effectively. In many cases, the entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. The Intruder crew had orbited for an hour. The attack itself was a handful of heartbeats, and then gone. On the airfield below, the wreckage burned, and every other crew scheduled to fly that night saw it, or heard about it, or felt its implications in the silence that followed. In the ground control stations nearby, confusion settled over the radar operators and plotting tables like frost on glass. A fighter that had been tracked on their screens, vectored home, cleared for approach, had simply vanished. The first assumption was always mechanical failure, an engine problem on final approach. a spatial disorientation error. These things happened in night operations. Every Luftwaffe unit had lost aircraft to accidents, to pilot fatigue, to the accumulated toll of flying complex machines in total darkness. It was unpleasant, but explicable. The war went on. But then it happened again, at another airfield, on another night. A night fighter that had successfully completed its interception, that had shot down a Lancaster over the North Sea and was returning with a confirmed kill, was itself destroyed within sight of its own runway. And this time, someone on the ground saw the brief flash of tracer fire from above, saw the outline of a twin-engine aircraft that was not one of theirs, saw it disappear into the darkness at a speed no Junkers 88 or BF 110 could match. This constant harassment had a detrimental effect on the morale and confidence of many Luftwaffe crews, and indirectly led to a high proportion of both aircraft and aircrew wastage from crashes as night fighters hurried in to land to avoid the Mosquito threat, real or imagined. The pattern began emerging in the intelligence reports. Airfields across northern France, Belgium, Holland, and increasingly within Germany itself were reporting unexplained losses during takeoff and landing phases. Aircraft that had survived combat over the bomber stream were being destroyed in their own traffic pattern. Pilots who had accumulated dozens of kills were dying not over enemy territory, but over the concrete they called home. For the German controllers, this was a new kind of problem. The Himmelbett system was designed to track and destroy aircraft heading into German airspace. It was not designed to protect the airfields themselves from lone attackers who arrived silently, waited patiently, and struck at the one moment when defense was nearly impossible. The radar network looked outward, toward the approaching threat. It did not look inward, toward the bases it served, and the Mosquitoes exploited this blind spot with ruthless consistency. If the takeoff interception was devastating, the landing trap was worse, because the landing trap exploited not just a tactical vulnerability, but a human one. The psychological state of a pilot returning from a combat mission at the end of his energy, his concentration spent, his relief at surviving one more night beginning to soften the rigid alertness that had kept him alive over the bomber stream. A German night fighter approaching its home field had been airborne for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours. It had burned through most of its fuel. Its crew had endured the sustained tension of stalking targets in the dark, the violence of close-range air combat, the disorienting buffet of a heavy bomber's slipstream as they closed for the kill. They were tired. They were cold. They wanted to be on the ground, in a warm room, with something to drink. The flare path came on. The tower cleared them to land. The gear came down, the hydraulics whining as the undercarriage locked into place. Flaps extending, speed decreasing. The aircraft settled into its approach glide slope, committed now to a path that would end on the runway or in the grass beside it. And in that moment, from the darkness above and behind, a Mosquito dropped. Luftwaffe aircraft returning to base were fair game for RAF night fighters like the Mosquito, which would lurk around an airfield and strike as they came into land. The geometry of a landing approach is inherently predictable. The aircraft must follow the extended center line of the runway. It must descend at a steady rate. It must maintain a constant heading. There is no evasive maneuvering on final approach. Every second, the landing aircraft is exactly where physics and procedure say it will be. For the Mosquito pilot, it was almost too easy. The target was slow, straight, and level, silhouetted against whatever light the flare path or the ambient glow of the airfield provided. The range was short. The deflection was minimal. The burst from 8 guns needed only to last a second or two. The German aircraft crumpled. Some blew apart in midair, fuel tanks igniting. Others crashed short of the runway, carving furrows in the turf, their wreckage marking the threshold like a warning. A few managed to absorb the damage and pancake onto the strip, but their crews were dead or dying inside shattered cockpits. The effect on airfield morale was corrosive. It is one thing to accept risk over the target. Every combat pilot accepts that. It is another thing entirely to fear the approach to your own runway. The landing trap struck at the transition point between combat and safety, the psychological seam where vulnerability is greatest because relief has already begun. Crews who watched their comrades destroyed on final approach carried that image into every subsequent landing of their own. The flare path, which should have meant safety, now meant exposure. The runway lights, which guided you home, also showed the enemy exactly where you would be and when. German after-action reports from this period reveal a growing unease that is remarkable for its restraint. Luftwaffe intelligence officers were precise men, trained to quantify threats and recommend countermeasures. But the reports from airfields subjected to repeated intruder attacks carried an undertone of something that statistics alone could not capture. Aircraft were being lost not to a visible, identifiable enemy, but to an invisible presence that arrived without warning and departed without being seen. The first indication of an intruder was often the destruction of a friendly aircraft. By the time guns could be aimed and searchlights directed, the attacker was gone. The speed of the Mosquito meant that even when it was briefly spotted, it could not be tracked, let alone engaged, by the defenses available at a typical operational airfield. The gradually increasing threat from the RAF fighters created what the Luftwaffe crews nicknamed Mosquito Panic as the night fighter crews. We're never sure when or where they may come under attack from the marauding fighters. Mosquito Panic. The name itself was telling, not a measured tactical assessment, a visceral response, a named fear. The reports describe crews requesting that flare paths be kept off until the last possible moment. Pilots asking for permission to orbit at a distance before committing to their approach, burning precious fuel in the process. Ground controllers receiving conflicting instructions from higher headquarters about whether to darken airfields entirely, which would protect against intruders but make it nearly impossible for their own fighters to land safely. It was a dilemma without a clean solution. Light the airfield and risk attracting a mosquito. Darken it and risk losing your own aircraft to landing accidents. In either case, the intruder won, not by being present every night at every airfield, but by creating the possibility that it could be present at any airfield on any night. And the Mosquito crews knew this. They understood that the psychological effect of their operations exceeded the physical damage by an order of magnitude. Every German night fighter pilot who hesitated before committing to his landing approach, every controller who delayed turning on the flare path, every ground crew member who scanned the dark sky above the runway before giving the all-clear, all of these were being affected by operations that might have involved only 2 or 3 mosquitoes on any given night. The disproportion was the point. A handful of intruders could influence the behavior of an entire night fighter force. The tactical ripple effects were measurable. German scramble procedures, which had been tightly synchronized with the bomber stream's progress through the Himmelbett zones, began to slow down. Airfield commanders became cautious about launching their fighters when the possibility of intruders was suspected. In the old system, the sequence was automatic. Early warning radar detected inbound bombers. Ground controllers alerted the night fighter bases. Engines were started, aircraft taxied to the runway, and takeoffs commenced within minutes. The speed of this response was critical because the Himmelbett system required fighters to be airborne and in position before the bombers entered their designated box. Every minute of delay was a minute in which bombers could pass through the zone unengaged. Now, a new variable entered the equation. Before launching, airfield controllers had to consider whether a mosquito was lurking above. A scramble into the path of an intruder would mean losing a fighter before it could accomplish anything, and the fighters lost this way were not replaceable overnight. Each one represented months of production, weeks of training, and the irreplaceable experience of a crew that might have been responsible for dozens of bomber kills. The delays were measured in minutes, but in the night air war, minutes mattered. A bomber stream could traverse a Himmelbett zone in 15 to 20 minutes. If the responding night fighter was launched 5 minutes late, the window for interception shrank by a third. If 10 minutes late, most of the stream would already be through. This was the cascading effect that Bomber Command strategists had hoped for. The intruders did not need to shoot down every night fighter to reduce the effectiveness of the defense. They needed only to inject hesitation into the system, and hesitation in a time-critical defensive sequence was nearly as lethal as a burst of cannon fire. A tired pilot, trying to land quickly on a dimly lit airfield patrolled by mosquitoes, might misjudge his approach and crash. A crew flying at low altitude to avoid being intercepted by a mosquito might run into a hillside. A night fighter crew would switch off their IFF equipment to avoid betraying their position and be shot down by friendly anti-aircraft guns. The losses that could be directly attributed to mosquito guns were only part of the story. The accidents caused by haste, by darkened airfields, by pilots too nervous to fly a normal pattern. These were indirect kills that never appeared in the Intruder crew's logbook, but counted just as surely against the strength of the German night fighter force. For the individual German night fighter pilot, the transformation was personal and profound. Before the Intruder campaign reached its full intensity, the cycle of a night sortie had a clear emotional architecture: tension during the briefing, anxiety at takeoff, intense concentration and fear during the interception phase, exhaustion during the return flight. And then, as the familiar landscape around the home airfield appeared in the darkness, a wave of relief so powerful it was almost physical. Home, safety, survival. The Intruder campaign destroyed that emotional architecture. It erased the relief phase entirely. Now the tension of the mission extended all the way to the moment the aircraft's wheels stopped rolling on the concrete. And even then, there was the walk from the dispersal point to the briefing room, across open ground where a strafing mosquito could appear at any second. This constant harassment had a detrimental effect on the morale and confidence of many Luftwaffe crews. The base was no longer a sanctuary. It was another zone of exposure. The runway was not a ribbon of safety, but a brightly lit stage where you performed the most vulnerable maneuver in aviation, the landing, while an audience you could not see might be watching from the darkness above. Some crews dealt with this by flying tighter, faster approaches, accepting the risk of a hard landing to minimize the time spent slow and exposed on final approach. This created its own accidents: undershoots, bounced landings, overruns, aircraft settling onto the ground at speeds that collapsed undercarriage legs and sent them skidding across the airfield in showers of sparks. Others dealt with it by requesting diversions to alternate airfields, hoping that the Intruder might be orbiting their primary base but not the secondary one. This burned fuel, complicated logistics. And sometimes the Intruder crew had been briefed on the alternate field as well. The most corrosive effect was cumulative. A pilot who survived one Intruder encounter, even one who merely heard about it from a squadron mate, carried that knowledge into every subsequent sortie. The fear did not diminish with repetition. It compounded. Each takeoff was a gamble. Each landing was a risk. The night fighter pilot, whose entire professional identity was built on being the hunter, now understood that he was also prey, and not over the target, not over the enemy's territory, over his own. This psychological inversion was the Intruder campaign's deepest achievement. It did not defeat the German night fighter force in the conventional sense of destroying it. It infected it. It introduced a parasite of doubt that fed on every mission, every return, every darkened runway. The strategic consequences accumulated gradually, the way water wears stone. No single Intruder mission changed the course of the air war. No single night of operations over German airfields produced a headline in the London papers or a mention in Churchill's war cabinet meetings. But month by month, the effect told. The methods employed by 100 Group were responsible for the destruction of 257 German aircraft from December 1943 to April 1945. Mosquito fighters from all units accounted for 487 German aircraft during the war, the vast majority of which were night fighters. During 1944 and 1945, the Mosquitoes of 100 Group claimed 258 Luftwaffe aircraft, shot down for 70 losses. These numbers represented only the confirmed kills, aircraft seen to crash or blow up, reported and verified through the rigorous claims process. They did not include the unknown number of German fighters damaged and later written off, the aircraft lost to accidents caused by Intruder-related haste or darkness, or the cumulative wastage of a force operating under constant psychological pressure. The interception rates began to decline, not dramatically at first. The German night fighter force was resilient, led by experienced pilots who had been fighting this war for years. But the margins were shifting. Where a Himmelbett zone might have achieved 3 or 4 successful interceptions in a night, now it achieved 2, or 1, or none, because the fighters were launched late, or diverted, or never launched at all. The main purpose of the group was to reduce escalating losses of RAF night bombers to the ever-increasing effectiveness of the German air defense system. And number 100 Group was succeeding. The Intruder campaign operated in concert with other measures. Electronic jamming from the heavy aircraft of 100 Group blinded German radar screens. Window chaff filled the sky with phantom returns. The group was a pioneer in countering the formidable force of radar-equipped Luftwaffe night fighters, using a range of electronic homers fitted to de Havilland Mosquito fighters, which detected night fighter radar and radio emissions, and allowed the RAF fighters to home in onto the Axis aircraft. Serrate-equipped Mosquitoes hunted German fighters in the bomber stream by homing on their radar emissions. These RCM aircraft were fitted with a device called Serrate to allow them to track down German night fighters from their Liechtenstein radar emissions, as well as a device named Perfectos that tracked German IFF signals. None of these measures worked in isolation. Together, they formed an interlocking system of disruption that attacked the German night defense at every level, from the ground control stations to the airborne fighters to the airfields where those fighters were based. The night sky over Germany was becoming untenable for the defenders, not all at once, not in a single decisive battle, but steadily, irreversibly, like a tide that turns in silence. None of this came without cost to the men who flew the Intruder missions. The Mosquito was fast and agile, but it was not invincible. Over German airfields, it operated within the envelope of dedicated anti-aircraft defenses that were alert, competent, and increasingly desperate. Light flak, the 20mm and 37mm guns that ringed every operational base, could reach the altitudes where Mosquitoes orbited. A single hit in an engine, a fuel line, a hydraulic system, could turn a successful mission into a catastrophe. From September 1944 through to May 1945, a total of 92 night-flying Mosquitoes of all marks on bombing, target marking, intruder, and night fighter operations were lost. Navigation at low level over blackened-out enemy territory at night was inherently dangerous. Even the best-trained navigator could lose position in the featureless darkness of the North German plain, where one stretch of farmland looked much like another, and the landmarks that appeared on the map were invisible from the air. Rivers that should have gleamed with reflected moonlight disappeared under overcast. Towns that should have shown as dark geometric shapes blended into the surrounding fields. The Mosquito crews operated alone, without the mutual support that a formation of bombers could provide. There was no wingman to warn of an attacking fighter, no tail gunner to cover the rear quarter. If a German night fighter happened to be in the right place at the right time, the Mosquito crew had only their own reflexes and their aircraft's speed to save them, and the cold was relentless. At altitude, the temperature inside a Mosquito cockpit could drop well below freezing despite the heating system. At low level, the crew was warmer but more exposed to ground fire. In either case, hours of flying in winter darkness over hostile territory exacted a physical toll that accumulated with each mission. The wooden airframe, for all its advantages, had vulnerabilities that metal. Aircraft did not. Battle damage that would have caused a dent in an aluminum wing could shatter plywood. A single cannon shell could open a wound in the structure that spread under aerodynamic stress. Crews returned with holes in their aircraft that looked like something had bitten through the fuselage. The radiators in the wing leading edge tended to be vulnerable to damage from enemy aircraft blowing up at close range, and it was not unusual for a night fighter to come back to base on a single engine. Although experiments were made with different radiator fits, they cut down the aircraft's performance too much to be worthwhile. The problem was never really fixed. For the Canadian crews in particular, the distance from home added a psychological weight that was difficult to quantify. They were fighting a war thousands of miles from the places where they had grown up, in skies they had never seen before, 1941 or 1942, over a landscape whose language they did not speak. If they were shot down and survived, they faced capture and imprisonment, or a desperate attempt to evade through occupied territory with the help of resistance networks whose reliability was never certain. Every Intruder mission was a solo journey into enemy territory with a high probability of returning safely, but a non-trivial probability of not returning at all. And the men who flew them did so repeatedly, mission after mission, night after night, carrying the accumulated fear of every previous sortie into the next. The real weapon was not the Hispano cannons or the Browning machine guns, though these were the instruments of immediate destruction. The real weapon was timing. The Intruder doctrine worked because it attacked at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Takeoff and landing are the two phases of flight where an aircraft is slowest, lowest, most predictable, and least able to maneuver. These are the moments when the machine is in transition between two states, ground, and air. And in that transition, it is defenseless in ways that no amount of armor or firepower can overcome. The Mosquito Intruder crews understood this instinctively. Their entire operational concept was built around patience and precision. They did not charge in. They did not make bombing runs against hangars or control towers, though some did drop bombs on airfield installations when the opportunity arose. Their primary method was the ambush. Arrive, wait. Identify the moment, strike, withdraw. It was the same principle that a predator uses in the natural world, not the dramatic chase, the patient stalk, the sudden burst of violence at the moment the prey is least prepared. Mosquito tactics included the tried-and-true night intruder game, orbiting around Luftwaffe airfields to pounce on unwary enemy night fighters. And the intelligence dimension was critical. Intruder operations were not random. They were synchronized with the main bomber offensive. When Bomber Command planned a major raid on a Ruhr target, the intruder squadrons were briefed on the German airfields most likely to be activated in response. The timing of the intruder missions was calculated to coincide with the scramble phase at those airfields, so that the Mosquitoes would already be in position when the night fighters began to launch. As the raiding force moved in, night fighter Mosquitoes of numbers 23 and 515 squadrons fanned out over Germany, making for the enemy night fighter bases likely to become active that night. When the intruders reached their objectives, they orbited, waiting to pounce on any aircraft seen taking off or landing. This synchronization multiplied the effect. The German night fighters were caught in a temporal vice. They needed to get airborne quickly to intercept the bombers, but getting airborne quickly meant launching into airspace that might contain an intruder. Delay the launch and the bombers escaped. Hasten the launch and you might lose the fighter. Either way, the defense suffered. Speed plus intelligence equals dominance. That was the equation. The Mosquito had the speed. Bomber Command's operational planning provided the intelligence, and the result was a form of dominance that operated not through brute force, but through the manipulation of time and fear. The psychological inversion was complete. The defenders of the Reich, the men whose job was to hunt bombers in the night sky, now had to worry about being hunted at their own doorstep. The fundamental asymmetry of the air war, in which the attacker chose the time and place of engagement, had been extended from the strategic level down to the tactical level. The Mosquito intruders chose when to attack. The German night fighters could only react. And reaction, when your enemy is faster, better informed, and already in position, is a losing strategy. Return, then, to that German pilot climbing into the darkness above his own airfield. His engines are running well. His instruments are steady. His ground controller is already vectoring him toward a bomber stream inbound over the Zuider Zee. In a few minutes, he will enter the Himmelbett zone, acquire his target, and begin the lethal approach that has made him one of the most effective defenders of the Reich. But the sky above his base is no longer safe. Somewhere in the dark above him, at an altitude he cannot see, and a distance he cannot judge, a Mosquito is watching. Two men from Canada sitting side by side in a cockpit that smells of hydraulic fluid and cold sweat. Their eyes adjusted to the darkness, their guns armed, their engines throttled back to reduce noise and exhaust glow. They have been there for 40 minutes. They will stay for another hour if they have to. They are patient. They are skilled. They have done this before. The German pilot does not know they are there. He will not know until the tracers come. Or he will not know at all, because tonight the Mosquito may not fire. Tonight may be quiet. Tonight the intruder may simply watch and wait and return to England without engaging. But that is almost the point. The German pilot cannot know. He can never know. He can only wonder, each time he lifts from the runway, each time he settles onto his approach, whether this is the night he becomes the target. The Kammhuber Line was built on certainty, radar that could track, controllers who could direct, fighters that could intercept. It was a system of knowledge, of information, of control, and the Intruder campaign undermined all of it, not by providing better information to the other side, but by injecting uncertainty into the German side, uncertainty about the safety of their own bases, uncertainty about the timing of their own launches, uncertainty about whether the dark sky above their runways contained only the empty cold of a February night, or something with teeth. The night fighter crews nicknamed this fear mosquito panic because they were never sure when or where they may come under attack. The Canadian crews who flew these missions did not fight in large formations. They did not drop 1,000-pound bombs on industrial targets. They did not fly in the vast streams that filled the night sky over the Ruhr and Berlin with hundreds of heavy bombers. Their war was smaller, darker, lonelier. 2 men in a plywood aircraft, circling above someone else's home, waiting to turn the enemy's own runway into a trap. They were not the most celebrated airmen of the war. Many of their operations remained classified long after the armistice. Their squadron histories were quiet documents, filed in archives that few civilians ever visited, but the effect of what they did resonated through the entire structure of the German night defense, from the highest command level to the individual pilot strapping into his cockpit for another sortie. 258. Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed for 70 losses. The numbers tell part of the story. The fear tells the rest. 418 squadrons claim of 178 enemy aircraft and 79.5 V-1 flying bombs destroyed made it the top-scoring unit of the RCAF. In the night war over Europe, Canada did not just fight the hunters, it hunted them at home.